The hand of the Almighty was heavy upon me, a weight that felt like the gathering of 1,000 storms before the first drop of rain. It was a divine pressure that transcended the physical realm, pressing into my very marrow. It was not a physical burden that one could cast off, but a spiritual pulling, a tugging at the very fabric of my soul that drew me away from the muddy banks of the Chebar River and the weary faces of my fellow captives. I felt the wind of the Spirit lift me, cold and ancient, carrying the scent of primordial dust and distant, forgotten ages where the breath of God first moved upon the face of the deep waters. We flew over the desolate, sun-scorched landscapes of exile, far from the shattered gates of Jerusalem and the weeping willows of Babylon where we had hung our silent harps in grief. Then the Spirit set me down in the center of a wide valley, a place where the sun seemed to lose its warmth and the sky turned the color of bruised iron, reflecting a world devoid of light. As my feet touched the ground, I realized I was not standing on earth or sand, but on a vast, tangled carpet of white, brittle remains that stretched toward the horizon in every direction. The valley was full of bones, thousands upon thousands of them, scattered like the seeds of a harvest that had been forgotten by time and left to rot under the unforgiving gaze of the heavens. I walked among them slowly, the sound of my sandals crunching against the calcified fragments of what were once fathers, sons, and brothers, each shard a silent testament to a life cut short by the sword. There were very many on the floor of the valley, an army of the dead laid bare and unburied, an affront to the dignity of man and a symbol of absolute crushing defeat. I observed them closely, and I saw that they were very dry, bleached white by the relentless desert winds and the passage of hopeless decades that had sucked every drop of moisture from their form.
Ow.
There was no marrow left in them, no hint of the life that once pulsed through their veins or the strength that once held their shields high in defense of the holy city. In the heavy silence of that wasteland, the Spirit asked me a question that shook the very foundations of my being. Son of man, can these bones live? I looked at the vast sea of desolation, at the fragments of skulls and the dust of ribs, and my human mind whispered a definitive no, for death had clearly claimed its final victory here. But I remembered the power that spoke the stars into existence and carved the mountains from the void, and I answered with trembling breath, "O Lord God, you alone know." My voice echoed against the jagged canyon walls, sounding small and frail in the presence of such absolute finality, yet it carried the spark of a faith that refused to yield to sight. Then he said to me, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Speak to the silence until the silence itself begins to tremble." It seemed a foolish thing, a madness born of grief, to speak to the deaf ears of the dead and to preach a message of hope to the cold. Unyielding silence of the earth, yet I felt a fire ignite in my chest, a prophetic burning that demanded utterance, a divine compulsion that bypassed my logic and seized my tongue with the authority of the heavens. I opened my mouth and spoke the words with a voice like thunder. "This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you. You will come to life." I told them of the promise of tendons, the gift of soft flesh, the protective covering of skin that would soon restore their form and hide the shame of their naked skeletal state. As I was prophesying, a sound began to emerge, a sudden sharp rattling that started as a whisper in the distance and grew into a deafening roar that filled the entire valley. The ground beneath me heaved and trembled as the bones began to move, drawn together by an invisible magnetic force of divine will that ignored the laws of decay and time. A bone sought its fellow with unerring precision. A rib found its spine, and the chaotic mess of the valley floor began to organize into thousands of distinct skeletal silhouettes. It was a terrifying and magnificent sight, a celestial reconstruction of humanity rising from the debris of the grave, proving that God remembers every fragment of his creation. I watched in awe as sinews appeared like silver threads, weaving themselves around the white frames with a precise surgical grace that no human hand could ever hope to replicate. Flesh began to climb up the legs and wrap around the torsos, filling the hollows where only shadows and dust had lived for generations, restoring the girth and stature of men. Skin covered them last, smooth and pale as marble, until the valley was no longer filled with bones, but with bodies laid out in perfect haunting rows under the iron sky. They lay there in their thousands, perfect in form and restored in stature, but they were still silent, and utterly devoid of the vital spark of existence. They were biological masterpieces without a soul. The valley was now a vast silent morgue, a collection of sleeping statues waiting for the touch of the divine architect to turn their clay into living spirit once again. Then he said to me, "Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, and say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain, that they may live." I turned my face to the vast horizons, calling to the north, the south, the east, and the west, summoning the Ruach, the holy wind that moved upon the waters at the dawn of time. I felt a great rushing of air, a cosmic suction, as if the atmosphere itself was being inhaled by the valley, a gasp of anticipation from the lungs of the universe. The wind began to swirl in violent eddies around the lifeless forms, tugging at their hair and dancing over their unmoving lips like a lover trying to wake a sleeping companion. Suddenly, a chest heaved with a sharp intake of air. Then another, and another, as the first lungfuls of oxygen were claimed by the resurrected from the very winds of heaven. Their eyes flew open, reflecting the gray sky with a new light. And life returned to their limbs with the staggering force of a returning tide crashing against a dry shore. They stood up on their feet, an exceedingly great army, a wall of living, breathing men stretching as far as the eye could see, their presence transforming the valley of death into a theater of life. The oppressive silence was broken by the thunderous sound of collective breathing, a rhythmic, powerful pulse of life that drowned out the haunting memory of the rattling bones. They did not look like the gaunt victims of exile or the broken prisoners of war. They looked like the iron vanguard of a kingdom that refused to die even in the face of annihilation. Then the Lord leaned close and said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They are the reflection of my people's shattered spirit and their lost hope." He told me how they cry out in the streets of Babylon, "Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off from our God and our future is buried in the sand." I understood then that the valley was not just a place of physical death, but a living mirror of the collective soul of a nation drowning in the depths of spiritual and political despair. Babylon had taken their land, burned their temple, and stolen their joy, leaving them as empty and hollow as the bleached remains I had first encountered in this vision. But the vision was a divine decree, a promise etched in the air that no grave is deep enough and no exile is long enough to hide those whom the Almighty intends to find. He commanded me to herald the message, "I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will lead you by the hand back to the sacred soil of the land of Israel." The prophecy shifted its weight from the literal valley of bones to the weary hearts of the living dead dwelling in the long, dark shadows of the Mesopotamian ziggurats. It was a message of radical restoration, a declaration that their current state of exile was merely a bridge, it's not a destination, and certainly not the final chapter of their story. Wisdom began to flow into my mind like a river, bringing the realization that God's power is never more evident than when all human hope has been ground into fine dust. I saw that the dry bones were a necessary precursor for the miracle. For without the absolute reality of death, there could be no true demonstration of the power of resurrection. The people had to be brought to the absolute end of their own strength, so they could finally witness the beginning of God's sovereign and extraordinary work of recreation. I stood in the midst of the living army, feeling the tangible warmth of their bodies and the heat of their breath, where there was once only the biting chill of the tomb. Their faces were etched with the deep lines of their past suffering, but their eyes were bright with the golden dawn of a new era that promised justice and peace. The Spirit then led me further into the hidden depths of the prophecy, showing me that life without unity is but a shadow of the glory God intends for His children. He told me to take 2 separate sticks, one marked for Judah and one for Joseph, representing the fractured and bickering tribes of a nation broken by its own rebellion. I held them together in my hands, and as I watched with bated breath, they fused together into one single piece of wood, becoming a solitary staff of undivided authority. This was the final lesson of the valley, that true life is not just about the individual breathing, but about the community becoming whole and harmonious once again. True wisdom is the deep knowing that the God who can knit shattered bones back together can also knit a fractured and bitter people into one single beating heart. I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the exile lift from my own spirit, replaced by a hope that was as solid and unyielding as the ancient mountains of Moriah. I thought of the elders of Israel who sat before me daily in Babylon, their faces lined with the grime of forced labor, and their voices heavy with the salt of constant lament. I knew I would return to them now, not with the empty words of human comfort, but with the raw, unquenchable fire of the valley burning in my very eyes. I would tell them that their dry bones were already beginning to rattle in the spirit, even if their physical ears could not yet detect the sound of the coming change. The vision taught me that the desert is never just a barren wasteland. It is a sacred laboratory for the miraculous where God proves his fidelity to his word. Every dry bone in our personal lives, the failed dreams, the lost loves, the broken promises, is a prime candidate for the transformative breath of the four winds. Ezekiel, the priest who was forced to become a watchman, now understood the true, terrifying, and beautiful nature of his calling among the captives. My duty was not merely to warn the people of the coming sword of judgment, but to loudly announce the coming life that would swallow death forever. I looked once more at the army, their ranks orderly and their spirits high, a living testament to the absolute sovereignty of the Creator over the forces of chaos. They represented the quiet persistence of faith against the overwhelming, noisy evidence of ruin and the mockery of those who believe the grave is the end. They were the definitive answer to the scoffers who whispered that the God of Abraham had forgotten his ancient covenant in the shifting dust of the east. As the vision began to fade into the ethereal mists, the valley started to dissolve, leaving only the profound weight of the truth it had imparted to my soul. The image of that great standing army remained burned into my mind's eye, a permanent fixture of my prophetic landscape that would guide my every word. I felt the wind lift me again, gentler this time, carrying me back across the miles to the harsh reality of the mud-brick walls and the slow-moving waters of the Chebar. When I opened my eyes in the dim light of my own house, the silence was heavy, but it was no longer the oppressive, stagnant silence of the grave. It was the pregnant, expectant silence of a seed buried deep beneath the winter soil, waiting with quiet confidence for the first warming sign of the spring sun. I immediately picked up my pen and began to record the wonders I had seen, capturing every rattle, every sinew, and every breath for the generations to come. I wrote of the dry bones, so that those trapped in the darkest nights of their own personal valleys would know that the dawn is not a possibility, but a certainty. I wrote of the intricate weaving of the tendons and the covering of the skin, of the loving detail with which the Father restores that which the world has broken. The message of Ezekiel is a universal message for every exile, for every soul wandering in a strange land that feels nothing like the home they once knew. It tells us with divine authority that our current state of dryness or emptiness is not our final destination, but merely the stage for a great awakening. Wisdom is the supernatural ability to see the army hidden within the pile of bones, and to see the towering forest sleeping within a single, dying ember. It is the holy courage to stand before the dead things in our lives, our habits, our griefs, our failures, and command them to hear the life-giving word of the Lord. For the word is the divine catalyst, the holy spark that sets the vast invisible machinery of the heavens into motion on behalf of the humble. I spent the remainder of my days teaching the people this truth, showing them that the power of the Spirit is infinitely greater than the political power of any empire. Babylon had walls of stone that seemed eternal and gates of brass that seemed impenetrable, but they could not stop the wind of God from blowing through a willing heart. The valley taught me that we are never truly cut off or forsaken as long as the Sovereign Lord remains the master of the breath and the king of the winds. I saw the weary faces of the children of Israel change as they heard the testimony, the light of hope returning to their eyes like stars appearing after a storm. They began to realize, slowly but surely, that their identity was not defined by the iron chains on their wrists, but by the golden promise of the coming resurrection. We were a people who had walked through the valley of the shadow, but we were a people destined to stand upon the heights of the mountain of the Lord. The bones were dry, it was true, but the God who fashioned them from the dust in the beginning was not finished with his masterpiece quite yet. My life as a prophet became a grand symphony composed around this single, powerful truth, that life, by the grace of God, will always triumph over the darkness of death. through the long and difficult years of my ministry in a foreign land. The memory of that valley served as both my steady anchor and my driving fire. When the world around me seemed most chaotic and the future of my people most uncertain, I would simply close my eyes and hear the rattling of the bones. I would remember the sudden surge of life and the opening of thousands of eyes, and I would know with absolute peace that God was still seated upon his throne. The prophecy of the bones is the ultimate myth, the foundational legend of hope that transcends the boundaries of time, culture, and geography to speak to every heart. It calls to us across the centuries, reminding us that no situation is too dead, no heart is too cold, and no nation is too broken for the touch of the divine. We are all invited to stand beside Ezekiel in the valley, to look at the wreckage of our own lives, and to dare to believe in the power of the holy breath. We are called to be the ones who prophesy to the wind, who invite the Ruach to descend and transform our personal desolation into a great and mighty army for good. For in the perfect economy of heaven, nothing is ever truly wasted, and no soul that cries out is ever truly lost to the shadows of the grave. The dry bones shall surely live, the heavy stone of the grave shall be rolled away, and the long exile of the soul shall end in the warm embrace of the Father. Thus concludes the vision of the valley, a timeless beacon of wisdom for all those who are currently seeking the light in the deep shadows of their own despair. Thank you for journeying through this ancient legend with us. If this story stirred your spirit, please comment, like, share, and subscribe to Channel Storycraft Studio.